Hello, people of the internet. I am Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir, and welcome to another installment of Kaiju's Corner, the podcast I like to use whenever I like to talk about stuff that normally doesn't really fit so well with any of the live streams or the other podcasts that I have called Shoe Watch. Here, this time with me, is a co-host that I've had before previously on Kaiju's Corner, that being the episode Do Critics Matter? Give it up for a fellow critic, one that you have whose articles you have most likely seen on Sci-Fi Channel's official website, sci-fi-wire.com. Give it up for the critic formerly known as the Unknown 837. It is the one and only truth teller, the unbiased one, the whatever other nickname my friends and I have given him. Give it up for Mr. Patrick Galvan.
Yes, now just a generic Patrick Galvan. Nothing unknown or mysterious about him whatsoever. Just generic, simple Patrick.
This is Patrick.
This is Patrick.
Is this the Unknown 837? No, this is Patrick.
This is Patrick.
Is this the unbiased truth teller?
Well, yes.
And so, for this episode, in case you haven't already taken a look at the title on the bottom of this YouTube video, we are going to talk about the Heisei period of Godzilla films, but not exactly Heisei the way most Godzilla fans interpret it. So, it's funny how we often just take words from another language and kind of reinterpret it to fit a brand new definition that may not really fit in line with its original meaning. Such is the case with the phrase Heisei. Now, Heisei, it represents the particular period of time in which the Heisei Emperor ruled from, I believe, 1989 up to this year of April 2019. So it's roughly about 30 years. And at this point, now we have entered the next era of Japanese history called Reiwa. And so, for the longest time, anytime a new emperor is in charge of the throne in Japan, that is officially when a new era ends and begins. And so, previously, there was the Showa emperor, and when he died, the Heisei emperor, his son, the Heisei emperor, took over. And for the first time in Japanese history, the Heisei emperor was like, you know what, I'm old, I'm tired, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm out. And so we are the Heisei era prematurely ended, and that allowed his son to take over, except he's also pretty old himself, so we're actually going to get the Reiwa era is actually going to go on for less time than the Heisei era. And in fact, the Showa era lasted as long as it did because I believe that emperor was pretty young when he started his run as the emperor. Mm-hmm. The only time this wasn't the case where they changed the name, I believe, was the Edo period. I think, I could be wrong, and maybe it's not the Edo period itself, but there was a point in time where one single family took control of Japan, and they never bothered to change the name. Except by the time a new family took over the throne, then they continued the trend of changing the name for each emperor. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. But for fans, when they think of Heisei, they generally tend to think of the Godzilla films of the 80s and 90s. Mostly because it's that is the period when Heisei kind of began, but not really, as we go into our retrospective. So, because in celebration of Godzilla, King of the Monsters being technically the first Godzilla film made within the Reiwa era, I decided to bring Patrick along to talk about all the Godzilla films of the Heisei period from 1989 all the way to 2018, since we technically didn't have a Godzilla film for the remaining period of Heisei, that being from January 2019 to April 2019. Fun fact, April 30th, 2019, the last day of the Heisei period, turned out to be my birthday.
Man, that must have been preordained.
Yeah, I guess so. It's all connected, all sort of rhymes. Each stanza kind of rhymes with the next.
I don't think it's a case of rhyming, just more of a case of Sorry, I'm splitting hairs.
It'll eventually rhyme. It's canon now. So I decided to bring Patrick along because, he's an individual who I highly respect with his profound knowledge on the history of not just Godzilla films, but in Japanese cinema, the larger picture of Japanese cinema. I always refer to him as like the next the next like Steve Reifel or Ed Godziszewski, someone I am, very very thankful to call a friend. And me being someone who's mostly focuses on like the end product, I thought it would be very great to have someone here with a better insight on the production history of these films to get a better, more in-depth look as we give a retrospective of our personal thoughts and feelings towards the Godzilla films from the last 30 years, essentially. So, are you ready, my friend?
I am ready.
Okay, so before we actually start with the first proper film, first technical Heisei film, that being Godzilla vs. Biollante, I figured we could talk about, give a brief mention on The Return of Godzilla, which was made in 1984, or Godzilla as it's known in Japan, or Godzilla 1984 as it's known on the American Blu-ray, or if you're going by the American cut, Godzilla 1985. So with this film, I would say like this film was sort of like the last hurrah for a lot of people who previously worked under the old vanguard of the Showa era, and this being like a send-off of like the original Showa era team, especially when you have Teruyoshi Nakano being the special effects director for this film, and he's kind of like the guy who took over Eiji Tsuburaya's spot after he passed away. So he kind of took over from like Ghidorah onwards up to this point. Am I correct?
Well, I should also mention like Sadamasa Arikawa was by technicality the special effects director for Sea Monster, Son of Godzilla, and Destroy All Monsters.
Ah, okay.
And technically Ishiro Honda was the special effects director for Godzilla's Revenge.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, that makes sense now. And after Tsuburaya's passing, Nakano officially became, the special effects director for the Godzilla franchise. Right. And I mentioned this before recording, a couple days before recording, how when you can easily tell that the Return of Godzilla was a Showa film compared to Koichi Kawakida's run as the special effects director, given how there's a vast difference in style and quality between between the Return of Godzilla and the rest of the Godzilla films of the 80s and 90s. And you can definitely tell, like, they were trying to, Koichi Kawakita and his new team really put a lot of a rather like a brightly colored, very visually extravagant feel, whereas like the Return of Godzilla was a more dark, more subtle style, had like a more subtle approach to its special effects.
Well, also, Return of Godzilla was also a lot of people who had also worked on that film were also like remnants from the original Showa team. Like the director, Koji Hashimoto, had actually been Ishiro Honda's assistant director in the 1960s. They'd worked together on films like King Kong vs. Godzilla, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Frankenstein vs. Baragon, Godzilla's Revenge. And actually, Hashimoto got the job for Return of Godzilla through Honda's personal recommendation, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yep, because as a lot of people know, Honda was actually asked to direct that film, Return of Godzilla. But this time, as many people know, Honda was, throughout the later part of his career, getting very burned out on doing science fiction. He did science fiction almost exclusively throughout the 1960s.
Right.
If I remember correctly, he made 18 films in the 60s, and only 2 were not special effects films.
Oh, wow.
And as you can imagine, he just got kind of burned out on the genre, but because of the Japanese film industry shrinking and declining, and because of the international appeal of science fiction, and the fact that he had basically pioneered the genre for Toho, basically all that closed in on him and gave him very few opportunities to do anything else. And by the time we get to the mid-1980s, Honda is no longer associated with Toho, and he's actually working with his best friend, the legendary Akira Kurosawa, on his last films of the 1980s and 90s. And so when Tomomi Tanaka and Toho came to Honda asking him to make this film, for him it was a very easy choice to say no, because he was finally getting a chance to work. By working with Kurosawa, he had an opportunity to work on samurai pictures, films about A family looking back on the legacy of the bombing of Nagasaki. The last film was a movie called Matadayo, which was about the hardships of growing old, which to Honda and Kurosawa, both being very old at the time, that would have meant a lot to them.
Yeah.
So he finally had an opportunity to work on the kind of films he'd always wanted to do, but didn't have much of an opportunity to do on his own. And he was working with his best friend of all people after so many years. So for him, it was a very easy decision, and he just said no. But even though he wasn't interested in making the film himself, he did say, you know what, I do have this former assistant of mine who worked with me on a number of monster films in the 60s. I think he could do it, and I would personally recommend that you hire him for the job. And also Hashimoto, having also worked on having made his directorial debut during that same year, a film called Sayonara Jupiter. He was also in a position where he could direct the film himself, and so that's actually how he got the job for bringing Godzilla into the new generation. And if I also might say, I don't want to jump too far ahead to the later Heisei directors, but
sure, okay.
But one thing that distinguishes Hashimoto from the other guys is that, you know, of all the directors of the quote unquote Heisei era,
by that we mean like 89 through 95, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
He was the only one who was old enough to have any kind of lasting memories of the sort of things that led up to Godzilla being what it is.
Okay, yeah. So this was like, so not only was this was still like a very generational thing. It was like, would it be fair to say that The Return of Godzilla was like one of the last films to be made by people who remembered the events that inspired Godzilla's creation?
Yes, absolutely. Because Hashimoto had been born in 1936, I believe. So he would have had very vivid memories of the social conditions that led to Godzilla becoming what it is. Whereas compared to, like, say, later directors like Takao Kawara or Kazuki Omori, like, I believe Omori was born in 1952, I believe, and I think Okawara was born in 49.
Okay.
So they were born long after World War II, and did not remember, like, the times that led to they don't remember the events that led to the creation of Godzilla in the first place.
Right. So from here on out, the people who took over the Godzilla franchise from Biollante onwards were the first generation of post-war Japanese citizens. And I would say that, the children of the post-war Japan generation, they definitely grew up during a significant change of Japan, where there was definitely a lot of peacetime collaboration with the US, a huge boom in Japanese entertainment. So these were people who kind of grew up on Godzilla films and other like sci-fi fantasy properties, be it television or film or otherwise. So that could explain why from Biollante onwards we had a more more fantastical take on Godzilla as opposed to the more grounded, realistic take of The Return of Godzilla.
Absolutely.
Okay. And do you happen to know why it took them 5 years to create a Godzilla sequel in the time between Return and Biollante?
Well, that's the very interesting thing about it, is that here's the thing, is that we should probably talk about how The Return of Godzilla was received in Japan when it came out.
Sure thing.
The film was actually, by all real measures, quite successful. It was the second highest grossing film of the 1985 movie year, which is when it would have done most of its business, because it came out in December of 84. So 85 would have been when it drew and had most time to make money at the box office.
Right. Oh yeah, I think all these Godzilla films from the 80s and 90s were released in December.
Yes, and the same would be true of the Millennium films.
Okay.
It wasn't until Shin Godzilla that tradition was changed. Right. Let's see. So it was the second most successful film of 1985. And also I should also mention that Return of Godzilla was also the first time Godzilla had been marketed for a mainstream audience since Destroy All Monsters.
Okay.
That's probably also worth saying, because from Godzilla's Revenge up through the 70s films, they were made primarily for kiddie matinees. They were not really made for mainstream audiences anymore.
And I believe that there were also like summer events where they would show them exclusively to like children, an audience of children.
Yep, the Triennial Toho Champion Festival, where they would play them along with animation and and also very condensed versions of past Godzilla films and other special effects things.
It's kind of it's kind of hilarious when you think about the more like violent scenes of the 70s Godzilla films being aired for being screened for an audience of children, especially in the case of like the portions of like Ghidorah when humans would be like disintegrated into skeletons.
Yeah, that is very true.
Yeah, they grew up with decapitations in Ultraman. They're okay with that.
Yeah, but they also watched the Gamera movie, so there we are.
These are people who probably grew up being scarred for life for Gundam. Oh wait, that won't be until 79. But anyway,
The Return of Godzilla was the first Godzilla film marketed for a mainstream audience since 1968, so almost 20 years.
Right.
Second highest grossing film of its year. But at the same time, Toho felt that even though it made money and it was very successful, and also I should mention, it came out at the exact same time in Japan as Ghostbusters and Gremlins.
Ooh, actually, wasn't Gremlins sort of a flop back then and sort of become... no, I'm not sure really anymore, but maybe go ahead.
I believe Gremlins was successful. I could be wrong, but I know Ghostbusters was the big worldwide hit of the year for '84. Right.
Yeah.
So having said all that, the fact that Return of Godzilla managed to hold its own at the Japanese box office and also be the second highest grossing domestic feature of the 1985 movie year. After Godzilla had not been marketed for a mainstream public for almost 20 years. Mm-hmm. That's actually pretty impressive.
Oh, yeah. I would definitely say it's also the nostalgic factor where it's like you just let a significant amount of time pass, in this case, roughly 10 years, and that's going to get people interested in the property again. It's like you need to take a little break before people start to miss it, perhaps. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it worked for Batman when it was rebooted in 2005.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the same time, though, even though it was successful, Toho at the same time had hoped that it would do even better than it did.
Oh, okay.
And so one thing they thought about was that maybe the reason why the film did not strike immense gold at the Japanese box office was maybe because it's a very old-fashioned kind of throwback kind of film, which it is. It's a very old-fashioned kind of movie.
True. Yeah.
And they thought, okay, maybe we should instead. And also, Hashimoto was like in his 50s when he made that film, I think.
It's like we got to get rid of these old fogies.
That's actually quite accurate because one of their ideas next was okay, instead of making an old-fashioned film, let's try to create something that's a little more, shall we say, modern, and hire somebody who's younger and who has a much more fresh aesthetic.
You got to get that young blood in there.
Hmm. So is this the point where you want to start segueing into the proper Heisei films now?
Right. Yes. So from then on out, it took them some good amount of time to get to, I guess, reshuffle or shuffle around their production staff, I'm assuming. I know there was that writing contest where they got to choose what pitch to turn into a full-on movie. One rejected pitch, which would have been kind of like essentially Godzilla versus Terminator, would go on to become Gunhead. And that would be, I believe, Koichi Kawakida's debut as a special effects director, which previously he was an assistant director for the 70s Godzilla movies like Ghidorah and Mechagodzilla.
Well, actually, Koichi Kawakita had done the special effects going back to the 1970s, actually. And not for Godzilla, though.
Oh, okay. So
he done the special effects for a war film called Zero. He done the special effects for Hashimoto's other directorial effort, Sayonara Jupiter.
Okay.
He done the special effects for there was another 80s film that I can't remember the name of, but Biollante would be his very first Godzilla film.
Right.
And he also did a Gunhead the same year.
Uh-huh.
Oh yeah, that's right. You were asking me why it took 5 years for a sequel to come out.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So what happened next was, as I mentioned, Toho wanted to make a Godzilla film that was a lot more, shall we say, quote unquote, appealing for a modern generation.
Uh-huh.
And they wanted to seek out a much younger director who had a much more fresh aesthetic, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we come into Kazuki Omori. Omori is kind of an interesting figure in the Godzilla franchise because he was a guy who grew on the one hand grew up with Godzilla, but on the other hand kind of grew out of Godzilla as he got older. He was
to be honest, that sounds very typical of the modern day Japanese audience.
It does actually very much so.
So it's interesting to see that things haven't changed in the 30 years since.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, Omori admits to having been a fan of Godzilla up through Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. At which point he was in like a middle school, I think.
Yep, that's usually the age when the people in Japan usually fall out of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Then he became more fascinated by things like the James Bond series. He's a big Bond fan. Films like The Sound of Music and The Great Escape. And to him, Godzilla was just kind of like, campy nostalgia, so to speak.
So it seems like in his as he grew older and he turned into an adult, as he was growing into an adult, he was definitely being influenced by American cinema at this point.
He is a very much a big admirer of American cinema. Absolutely.
Okay.
And you also can kind of tell just watching the films that he writes and directs in the Godzilla series.
We'll definitely get into that. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, Omori, at this point in his life, is no longer big into Godzilla, and he told Toho this from the start, I'm not a big Godzilla fan. I don't dislike Godzilla, but he's just not the kind of thing that interests me.
Yeah, it's not my thing.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he'd been at the same time, Omori at this point was this is also kind of fascinating about him is that he's actually a licensed medical practitioner.
So he's Dr. Kazuki Omori.
He is, yes. And actually, I don't know how the hell he had time to do this, but he also got started making films while he was in the process of attending medical school.
You know what? I'm not that surprised because from what I understand, at least in the modern day Japanese university system, it doesn't take as long to become a doctor as it does in America, where I think in America you need 4 years for a bachelor's, 2 years for master's, and another 4 years for a doctor, for a PhD. Whereas in Japan, I think it could be around 5 or 6 years, because you can just start directly from work your way as a doctor from the beginning of your Japanese education and work from there on out.
Oh, okay. All right.
I could be wrong though, but I believe that's what I learned.
Okay, well, we can always, as if anybody knows more about this, just feel free in the comments.
Absolutely, yes. We don't claim to be experts on everything.
No, we're not. I'm just a well-read fan. That's all I am.
And I'm just an opinionated YouTuber. In other words, an average YouTuber.
But anyways, at the same while Omori was attending medical school, he was starting his film career, and he was actually getting a lot of notices in film festivals and such. And also, he was his films were definitely appealing to a younger demographic of audiences. Mm-hmm. And he made a film called I believe called Orange County Road, I think was the name of it. That's something like that. But he also made a film called Disciples of Hippocrates, which was a film which I've seen, which is a film about medical students. So no doubt inspired by his own experiences as a medical student.
Right.
And he was getting lots of notices, lots of awards, et cetera, and so forth. And it was that combination plus a recommendation from a group of Osaka-based Godzilla fans that led to him being hired by Toho to make Godzilla vs. Biollante. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, Omori was brought on board in 1985, just 1 year after the return of Godzilla.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was also the same time when they were doing the script contest for Biollante.
Oh, so everything seemed to be done early then.
Mm-hmm. Now, as for why they waited
till 89,
waited 4 more years for something actually happened.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very curious thing, and this is why I really wish that as you may know, Ed Gottschalk was originally going to do he had done an audio commentary for the Echo Bridge release of Godzilla vs. Biollante. Uh-huh. But that commentary never came to be. Never got published on the disc because Toho. Okay, this is a small tangent, but this is inevitable with us.
Sure thing,
tangent. Of course. Toho's audio commentaries are very unusual. First thing they want to do is they want you to script out your commentary in great detail, a full-fledged script, and they want to then approve it.
Okay, so it's like if we were to script out our entire podcast and have someone else take a look through it before we actually record it this way.
And also, we'd have to follow it verbatim.
Uh-huh.
Word down to the last word. You can't make any changes whatsoever.
Right.
So, and then once you're finished with that, then they have to listen to and approve the final commentary.
Okay.
And unfortunately, Toho took their sweet, precious time in improving the commentary, and Echo Bridge had a deadline for releasing the disc. And they just could not afford to push the deadline back to wait for Toho, and so unfortunately, the disc got released without the commentary. However, that said, one of the reasons why I wish that commentary had been released is because I would love to know what Ed had been able to dig up as to why there was like a long gap between the films.
Right.
Now, from what David Callett writes in his Godzilla book, it sounds like Toho wanted Omori to have more, shall we say, practice within their system, and they had him making films throughout the later part of the 1980s, while he was rewriting the winning script for the Biollante contest. And so there's a little bit of a variety of reasons as to why it took so long to get off the ground. So Omori was making films for Toho during that period of time, and they had the script being rewritten, et cetera, and so forth. And then finally, 4 years after the return of Godzilla, we finally get the sequel, Godzilla vs. Biollante.
Right. And from here, we know it's like a massive tonal shift. It's, in a way, it still tries to carry on that continuity from Godzilla, Return of Godzilla, by taking place directly, like mere moments after Godzilla's defeat, getting shoved into Mount Mahara. And I it's like something we haven't really seen in a Godzilla movie, of having like direct continuity since like the only one I can think of is perhaps like Terror of Mechagodzilla from 1975. And I would say it was like a very nice change of pace. It felt very, very new. It felt like, we're actually going to get a legit series of Godzilla movies where the story continues from here on out. And right from the get-go, you can already see that sort of American influence with what I like to call like a very a large influence of 80s action films.
And absolutely.
And of course, there's also sort of that political espionage, Bond-esque thriller type of subplot going on between the Seradian agent, between the Americans, the Japanese governments, and everyone's trying to scramble for control of Godzilla's cells that were collected in the aftermath of Godzilla's initial attack. And I thought, it's a very interesting premise. I love the idea of Godzilla having this sort of real world, or this sort of like influence over how the political game has changed. And unfortunately, I feel like beyond Godzilla vs. Biollante, this idea of Godzilla having an effect trickling down the political system is sort of lost from after this film.
Yeah, it's prevalent a little bit in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, but after that point, it's really not touched on at all from there on out.
Right, and it's a real shame, and it could be like perhaps the reason why they moved away from this more like politically infused version of Godzilla. They probably moved away after Biollante, probably because like the film, from what I understand, didn't do very well, so they decided to go more into that fantasy sci-fi aspect, starting with King Ghidorah.
And also, the director who came after Omori will also have played a factor in that, I believe. But we'll get to him when we get down to that his films.
Right. So for what we know with Kazuki Omori, he took over with Biollante and also did King Ghidorah as well. And I would say
actually one more thing I want to say about Biollante is that it definitely, as far as its science fiction goes, it definitely also represents a very post-war aesthetic because it's about bioengineering.
Yeah.
Like I should say, the Return of Godzilla is very modern for its time. So it dealt with the Cold War and such. But bioengineering was definitely a very of its time kind of thing. It was definitely a very new kind of subject for when they made that film. Whereas Return of Godzilla dealt with nuclear technology, relationships between nations, and it was done in a modern way for its time, the Cold War.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Honda had made films like that, back in like the 60s and the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a modern update of those old kind of themes done in a modern context.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas bioengineering and Biollante, when we get to that film, it's distinctly new for the Godzilla series by that point.
Okay. And I also found the spiritual aspect of Biollante to be rather interesting. Well, with the introduction of Miki Sagusa and like her coming from like a school of psychics and the idea of like not Katsura, what was her name? Why am I blanking on the professor's daughter's name?
Oh, Erica.
Erica, right. And Erica's spirit somehow, the ghost being trapped in the body of this horrific monster. Sort of like the fact that her father, Dr. Shiragami, could not let go of her daughter. It's like tying her into this monster, very poetic. I am curious as to where this like spiritual aspect of Godzilla vs. Biollante came from. I can understand where the sci-fi aspects and the more action, political thriller oriented elements came from, but I do wonder what was the inspiration behind that more that spiritual aspect.
That's a good question. I know that Miki Sagusa was actually inspired by Stephen King's novel Carrie.
Oh, okay. That's
the idea of a young teenage girl with psychic powers. That's where that idea came from. I'm not sure about the spiritual aspect, though. Okay. It could have come from. I wouldn't be surprised if it came from an American source of some kind. Because as I mentioned, Omori is a big fan of Hollywood cinema.
Yeah, and those Hollywood influences do get more pronounced as time goes by.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do.
Yeah. But I would say, as the first movie of the Heisei period, I thought this was like and especially for Kazuki's first Godzilla movie, and for Koichi Kawakita, I feel like this team did a bang up job in really giving us a really engaging, action packed, dazzling Godzilla film to wrap up the 80s. And I feel like, during that lull between Return of Godzilla and Biollante, I would say that Biollante is like the jolt of energy it needed to help this new series of Godzilla film like stand apart from what came before. And it pains me that this movie didn't do so well, because I would have loved to have seen Godzilla movies continue with this level of quality.
Yep, and from what I understand, it sounds like we can really... Toho likes to blame that on the fact that Biollante was an obscure monster. I think that may have been a factor, but I think the big dominant factor was the fact that 5 years had passed since the last Godzilla film, and Toho barely promoted Biollante whatsoever. If you look at
it's like a self-defeating cycle here.
It is. Like, if you look at like the promotional stuff they did for Return of Godzilla, Toho went out of their way to promote that film.
Yeah, they want to let you know Godzilla is back.
But with Biollante, they barely advertised the film whatsoever. So after 5 years of not seeing this character on the big screen, then a new film comes out without much advertisement. I think that's not too surprising. The film did not do especially well at the box office.
Right. And so this would be a nice segue into how King Ghidorah came about. Although, are there any other things you want to talk about with Biollante before we move on?
Not that I can think of.
Okay, so yeah, another couple years pass, although not as much as to the degree of Return of Godzilla. So maybe Toho learned their lesson there, perhaps. So we now have Kazuki Omori, still here with his final Godzilla film. We have Koichi Kawakita back. And I think there was an interesting story you may have told me where Koichi Kawakita was really insistent on giving it his all for Biollante in the hopes of being acknowledged by the Japanese Academy Awards. But when he did not get the attention or did not get the approval or the appraise that he wanted, he sort of kind of just gave up from here on out and just sort of phoned his work in.
Well, and also the other thing is that Kawakita was unfortunately also an alcoholic.
Oh, okay.
And that also may have very much negatively influenced his work ethic and such.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if it's true that he was they took the fall for Biollante personally. That may be true. I wouldn't be surprised.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it is definitely true that his special effects from this point on are not as resourceful, not as imaginative, not as carefully executed as they were in Biollante, unfortunately.
Yeah. But that said, I feel like with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, not just from the special effects wise, but storytelling, acting, character wise, I feel like this is a perfect example of a movie that's greater than the sum of its parts. Where it's like, if you really take a closer look at all these elements, a lot of stuff here doesn't really work, especially with the time travel logic, which, trust me, we'll get into that. But I feel like the whole thing collectively works together as a whole, works better as a whole, and that there was still a level of creativity, a lot of imagination, a lot of emotion, a lot of heart into this movie that I still feel like is another worthy successor in this new continuity of Godzilla films, and continues the trend of going with this very bombastic sci-fi spectacle of the Heisei genre, or as I guess from here on out we can call the Godzilla series the Versus series, as like Japan, we as Americans might like to call the 80s and 90s films the Heisei series, but for Japan I believe they call everything from Biollante to Destoroyah the Versus series. I guess named after the fact that all these titles have much simpler names as opposed to something, giant monster battle, great fight in the Pacific Ocean, Godzilla, Ghidorah, Ebirah, Mothra, so-and-so, all-out attack.
Gezora, Ganaim, Kamiba's decisive battle, giant monsters of the South Seas.
To quote James Rolfe himself, just rolls off the tongue.
Absolutely. Which makes me wonder, if you were a Japanese film goer going to see Space Amoeba in 1970, how would you ask for a ticket? Do you read out the entire Japanese title, or do you just read out part of it? I mean, with a Godzilla film, you'd probably just say, Gojira, and they get it. But, with unfamiliar names like Gezora, Ganaim, and Kamiba's, what do you say?
It probably sounds a lot simpler, more easy to pronounce in Japanese.
Oh, I'm sure.
But
I would actually say that Biollante itself is also a film that's greater than some of its parts, because Biollante does have some balancing issues as far as clearly explaining certain things here and there. But it still works tremendously well in the final result. It's still a fantastic movie.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I would say King Ghidorah is not quite as good, but it's pretty close.
Right, I totally agree with you there.
Yeah, King Ghidorah is also one of my favorite Godzilla films. It's one of the most relentlessly entertaining Godzilla films I think made since the Showa era.
Absolutely,
I mean, it's just nonstop entertainment from start to finish.
Another interesting thing to note here is that we also got the first definitive Godzilla origin that's actually depicted in film, kind of, sort of.
Yeah.
For a while, it's always been sort of left vague as to whether Godzilla was a mutant or was simply awakened by the nuclear bombs or nuclear testing. But here it's they go out of its way to portray him as a very tragic character, not just for being the first one of his kind, but also being originally the last of his kind, as far as we know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because in the original Godzilla, all they state is that Godzilla was awakened by the H-bomb and that he absorbed a lot of radiation from the blast.
Mm-hmm.
They don't outright state that he was mutated by. Yeah, but of course, the inference is very much is that he was affected by it, but they don't outright specify that in the film.
Right. And it's very interesting that they decided to use time travel here to introduce that concept, to take a look at a pre-mutated Godzilla, which has gained a fan following, and this mutated origin has stuck around in the fandom for a good while, up until the American Godzilla film, the second American Godzilla film. Let's see. We had King Ghidorah back, after a long period. I think his last appearance was back with Gigan. I guess you can say Mechagodzilla if you want to count that that very confusing cameo. Terror Mechagodzilla also, I think, alluded to Ghidorah as well.
Yes.
But yeah, basically he hasn't been seen since the 70s. He's back now with a very like streamlined design, very just as lavishing as he looked back in the 60s. A very nice update. We have some characters, very interesting. Shindo is one of my favorite characters from like the Godzilla's franchise as a whole.
Oh yeah.
We have
and actually, I might say the actor Yoshio Tsuchiya, who also played the controller Planet X in Monster Zero, and the scientist who jumps out the window and is monsters. You've seen him in a lot of things. Shindo was his all-time favorite movie role.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's a veteran Godzilla actor, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's his favorite role, not just of Godzilla, but his entire career in general.
Oh, that's very good to hear.
And keep in mind, he also worked with people like Kurosawa and like Seven Samurai and such. So he worked with a lot of big name people, and he always felt that Shindo was his favorite role of any film he worked on.
Let's see. I liked what was it? The character, the main character, Kenichiro Terasawa, played by Kosuke Toyohara, where he sort of plays that similar, like, young, brash, like, sort of underdog type of character that similar to the protagonist of Godzilla 84. Sort of like, a very average Joe sort of character that's easy, very relatable to the audience. Emi Kano is a great character, someone who, was worked for the villains, makes a turn, has a change of heart and works for the protagonists. And we have fan favorite M11, played by the one and only Robert Scott Field, who has had a tremendous impact in maybe not so much for the Godzilla franchise, but for like the community as a whole. God bless this man.
Hey, he's got the most amazing run cycle in history.
Absolutely. Yes. Speaking of which, with MLM's introduction, there's clearly a Terminator influence here.
Oh, yeah.
The time travel thing, I would argue that this was perhaps like an influence from like the success of Back to the Future.
You are absolutely correct, because here's the thing, Biollante did not, as we mentioned, did not do very good when it first came out. But guess what was the biggest hit in Japan? Back to the Future Part 2.
Great Scott!
That was the big hit of 1989 when Biollante did not do so well. And that's why they chose to do a time travel thing for Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah.
Yeah. And usually people wait until they've run out of ideas to skip ahead to time travel. It took Marvel 10 years to do that.
It's true.
Let's see. Yeah, so we definitely got that. It's interesting to note how in the movie they state that Japan becomes a superpower that controls most of the world's economy, and that this what motivated the time traveling terrorists, the Futurians, as some fans like to call them, to go back in time and pretty much exterminate or eradicate Japan off the face of the earth. And I believe this was inspired by the tremendous amount of economic growth that Japan was experiencing at the time, to the point where people were assuming that Japan would take over the world, at least from like an economic standpoint, of being like the richest, most wealthiest country in the world, which of course, like, its success never really went that far, and it petered out once it entered the new millennium. But it's a very interesting time capsule as to the world's perception of that. And it's very interesting that Japan is acknowledging that within its own entertainment. Like, we saw that a little bit of that with Blade Runner, with it having the future Los Angeles having a Japanese influence. You can see there's kanji and katakana everywhere. There's Back to the Future 2, where Marty McFly's boss is Japanese. I think even RoboCop 3 even had a bit of a Japanese influence there, with the villains being a new corporation that was buying out Omnicorp. So yeah, you can definitely see a lot of it there, where it's usually like the bad guys, or there's not bad guys, but there's always like an influence of Japanese culture, not because everyone in Hollywood was a bunch of weebs, but rather they were just afraid that, okay, maybe that was partly the case, but there was also that idea that Japan would take over, have this sort of like corporate takeover of American culture. And the fact that you have terrorists here that want to stop that is a very interesting choice, and really puts things into perspective as to the sort of like the worldwide mindset at the time.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I argue that King Ghidorah is kind of like the last Godzilla film, which deals with that, international social political aspect that the later Heisei films would not deal with so much.
It It's very
because
interesting.
it is a film that was made in the after effect of the bubble made towards like the end of the big bubble economy of the 80s.
Right.
In which Japan's economy just like exploded big time,
right.
And you had Japanese companies acquiring properties from all around the world. Like leading up to this film, you had the Japanese were acquiring the Rockefeller Group in America. They were acquiring golf courses in the United States. They were acquiring
golf courses.
Yeah, but not only that, but also they acquired a golf course that the U.S. Open was played on, which had a lot of people kind of, for lack of a better word, upset at the time.
It's like, there's an awful lot of Japanese writing around this grass field.
Yep, and that's what led to a Japan game kind of infamously known as Japan Incorporated at the time. And supposedly, from what David Callan writes, USA Today ran an article around that same time period saying, "Will Japan end up buying it all?"
The answer, no.
No, but there was that kind of socio-political concern at the time.
Yeah.
And that is kind of reflected in a more exaggerated way in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, where Emi explains that Japan will one day go on to swallow up other nations to the point where it basically controls the entire planet.
And it's kind of interesting how they mention the rising economy of Japan, because in subsequent films of Japan somehow gains I guess I'm assuming, this is just me being very fanboy theory here that's probably not meant to be taken seriously, but it's interesting how in subsequent films, Japan's economy within this continuity somehow becomes great enough to be able to finance the creation of such large-scale robots like Mechagodzilla and the Garuda, Mogira, and of course maintain G-Force as a whole.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that's just more of them going for the fantasy element.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, I suppose if you want to do a fan theory thing, that makes good enough sense.
Did the Futurians predict the economic military power of Japan in the Godzilla series? But hey, that's just a theory, a G theory, and cut. Of course, it's fan theory. They didn't intend it to write that way. Just like how they didn't intend for a goddamn time loop theory, loop to happen. Let's get into that. Okay, so I've criticized this movie a lot. A lot of fans and other people have criticized this plot for having one of the worst handling of time travel logic, in a way where it's like it wants to. For all intents and purposes, the way this movie is written, the characters, the writer, everything here leads the viewer to believe that this is a movie that is running on the logic that if you can change the past, you can change the future. They went back, they left the Dorats in Japan, on what's it called, Lagos Island, that led to the creation of Ghidorah in the present day. They go back to change the future of Japan. When Emi Kano goes to the future, Japan is no longer a thing. What was it? She goes back in time to save Japan from Godzilla with Mecha King Ghidorah. Now there's a Japan, as far as we know, as far as the audience is led to believe, now Japan's future is secured in the future. So everything has a cause and effect sort of situation throughout the movie that lets us to believe that this is how time travel works in Japan in this movie. However, by erasing Godzilla from history, once they come back to the present, they think, okay, so now Godzilla is no longer there. When in reality, Godzilla is still there. He's just in another location with a new retcon origin. That's that has a blink and you miss it explanation, with him simply just getting mutated in a different way.
Yes,
I believe it was nuclear waste that was dumped by the Russians, I think.
It was an American submarine that crashed in the 1970s.
Okay, yes. I knew it was the 70s. I forgot it was the submarine. So yes. So instead of being created in a roughly, his origin was this, and that's another thing. Whether or not this is the same Godzilla as 54. Again, Destoroyah establishes that it's a new Godzilla, but it's never touched upon in this movie. So for all intents and purposes, a lot of people like to think, oh, they got rid of the 54 Godzilla. Meanwhile, the 84 Godzilla still exists to this day. For all intents and purposes, this movie focuses on one Godzilla. It never focuses on any other 54 Godzilla. It just focuses on one Godzilla. If it was like, oh, they got rid of one Godzilla, but they got rid of the 54 Godzilla, but they didn't count on the 84 Godzilla. No. If that was the case, they would have brought it up in the screenplay. This is screenwriting 101. And for fans, of course, fans love to theorize. I just theorized right now, but I know I'm not taking it seriously because, again, It's not what the writers most likely intended. Otherwise, they would have explained it. But for fans, they want, for things that don't make sense, such as people still remembering who and what Godzilla is in this movie, they want, for many fans, when things doesn't make sense, they like to play around in their heads, try to find a way to explain the things that don't make sense in particular movies. Hence, that leads to fan theories. And, there are fans who take fan theories really seriously and some who don't. I, for one, am one of those people who simply accepts the fact that, hey, these writers fucked up. They're only human, and that's perfectly okay. Meanwhile, for other people, it's like, no, this has to make sense. There has to be an explanation for this. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the famous Wikizilla video that explains a time loop theory where Godzilla was always meant to exist. They didn't prevent Godzilla's creation. They inadvertently caused the Heisei the 90s Godzilla's own creation. So it's like by going back in time and preventing Godzilla's creation, you actually caused his creation. That is a very interesting theory, and that is a concept that I've seen done time and time again, where a character goes back in time to prevent something, only to be the exact cause of that thing. But again, if that was the case, it should have been established within the screenplay itself, but it isn't. So if it's not acknowledged by the characters or the story or the writer, then that simply was not the intention of the writer himself. And that's what I focus on primarily. And even if you do focus so much, even if you don't care about the writer's intention and focus on your own interpretation of the movie, it still doesn't make sense to me, because it's like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have the logic that time travel creates its own future, but then have the same cause and effect thing that we have throughout the movie. Mm-hmm. For me, the time loop theory only raises more questions than answers. What are your thoughts, my friend? As someone who used to believe in the time loop theory, you were a believer themselves. Maybe you can talk some sense into these crazy fans that want to shove this video down my throat. It does make sense.
Yeah, well, actually, I should say, first of all, the time loop theory actually comes not from Wikizilla, but Wikizilla.
Oh, Sci-Fi Japan.
Yeah, it comes from Sci-Fi Japan, an article written by a gentleman named Keith Aiken.
Fuck you, Keith Aiken. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure you're a fine gentleman.
He's actually a very knowledgeable guy. But he wrote that article for Sci-Fi Japan, and it's kind of like his explanation as to how the continuity of the Heisei films work.
Uh-huh.
And I will say this: his explanation makes the most sense of any fan theory for that film I've ever heard in my life.
Uh-huh.
Compared to the others, it makes a lot more sense. However, it doesn't. His article, as good as it is, and as noble as it is, as valiant as it is, and as persuasive as it was for me on a first glance, it still falls into the same general problem that you talked about, which that it depends. Its core value is centered upon a key plot element that is never mentioned or talked about in any of the Heisei films.
Right.
Because the word time loop is never mentioned once.
Right.
In King Ghidorah.
All they mentioned was Godzilla's creation was inevitable, that humanity was bound to fuck up and create another Godzilla.
Yes. And here's the thing. If you actually watch King Ghidorah very carefully, they play it up very definitely that the original Godzilla and the Heisei Godzilla are the same monster.
Oh yeah, because again, they never acknowledged the existence of two Godzillas, and if there were, they would have brought it up.
Yes. When the Futurians bring Terrorist's book from the future, which Godzilla do you see on the cover? The original.
Ah, yes. So for all intents and purposes, in the context of this film alone, there is only meant to be one Godzilla in history.
Yes, and also when the Futurians go back to their plan is to go back to Logos Island during World War II and move the Godzillasaurus on the island so he does not become hit by an H-bomb. What year was that bomb to go off? They state this date in the film. What year was that? 1954. They state that date very clearly in the film.
Mm-hmm. So this is supposed to be Godzilla 54's origin.
Correct. Yes. And
Heisei Godzilla's origin.
Yes. And there is no point in the film where anybody says, "Oh, holy shit, we were wrong. There were two Godzillas the whole time. Two Godzillas. What does it mean?" There's yes, I
understood that reference.
You'd be a very bad Godzilla fan if you didn't. But yes, there is no point in the film where anybody even suggests, let alone states, there were two Godzillas. All they specify was that they moved the Godzillasaurus away from Logos Island, put him underneath the Bering Sea, and then he became Godzilla again in 1977 when that nuclear submarine crashed in the Bering Sea, and he became exposed to all the nuclear contaminants contained within. So all they did was delay Godzilla's creation, not prevent it, not time loop it, not rework it, just delayed his creation by about 23 years. Mm-hmm. So that said, if you go by what's actually said in the film, the events of the original Godzilla film are erased completely. Mm-hmm. And Godzilla does not exist until 1977.
And the reason why everybody still remembers Godzilla as a thing, simple. I've said it. Right. I said it back in like 2015, 2016. I'll say it again. Bad writing. Yes. They just simply didn't want to have characters. Maybe it did cross their minds, but maybe at some point, the writer said, "You know what? Wait, wasn't the writer and the director the same person?"
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So Omori was probably thought, it's like, fuck it. I don't want to spend an entire scene of these characters catching everyone up to speed on what happened. Because they're probably going to be like, wait, who are you? Why did we send you back in time to kill who now? Again, it was probably too much trouble for him to write that scene and was like, fuck it! And again, we should keep in mind that the mentality of the production history of these films, that they were at this point, from here on out, they're going to be made one movie a year, and from here on out, it's like they sort of take a very fast and loose approach to the continuity of this series, where they're constantly retconning shit, making it up as they go with no plan at all, no end goal. They're just like, as long as the movies are popular, let's make these movies, but let's give each movie a definitive ending in case this was the last movie. Sort of.
Yep, so to recap, the reasons why I don't buy into the time loop theory anymore is because, number one, they never state, even remotely, that there was a time loop in the film.
But Destoroyah, they established it. It's Biolante's brought up in Space Godzilla. Again,
we'll get to that.
Fast and loose, man. Fast and loose.
We shall get to that. So, point number one, they never specify. Point number two, they state very definitely that they're trying to prevent Godzilla from being born in 1954. That's not my interpretation. They state that in the film. Mm-hmm. Number two. And number three, when they do bring up the original Godzilla in Destoroyah, thereby establishing there being two Godzillas, they don't do it in a, aha, we learned the truth kind of way. They do it in a, how can we explain Destoroyah kind of way?
Right.
That's it. And we'll get to Destoroyah when we get to Destoroyah, but
right.
Those are the three big reasons why I don't buy it anymore, because they don't establish it. They played it quite definitely in this one film. Number three, they never even address it again. They never try to resolve it in any kind of way, time loop kind of way in the remainder of the series.
Yeah.
And here's the thing, it's become very popular, especially in this post Stanley Kubrick world, to try to overanalyze films and try to assume that the directors were playing games with us But you know what? Not every film is a 2001: A Space Odyssey. So, sometimes what you see is what you get.
Well, if you notice on the spaceship of the Futurians, there are these numbers right here, and these numbers could actually be a little code that's meant to tell us that the moon landing was faked in the 60s.
But yeah, so like I said, the movie is tremendously entertaining.
Yeah,
it's one of my favorite Godzilla films.
I still think it's a great movie.
Yeah, it's a tremendously entertaining film, but it's from a screenwriting standpoint, just like Biollante, it has a lot of issues, and I would say probably more than Biollante did. Mm-hmm. That said, it certainly does not wreck my enjoyment of the film. Mm-hmm. But the time travel makes no sense.
And I will say, like, special effects wise, Koichi Kawakita still has it. I personally enjoyed I'm not that big of a fan of the 91 redesign. I'm not sure why they had to redesign him at all. I guess they wanted to signify some kind of change by making him look more buff. A Godzilla buff, I mean. But I still enjoyed the action scenes involving him. I still enjoyed the model work with him. I love what they did with Mecha King Ghidorah. Although Mecha King Ghidorah is sort of like a sign of Koichi Kawakita's issue that he gets in later movies, where he focuses on design over practicality, or design over functionality, where King Ghidorah was so big and heavy and elaborate that they literally couldn't put a suit actor inside it. But I did like the innovative way they worked around that by having Ghidorah mainly stay in place, or just use like a bunch of wires to, move him around, or to make it look like a convincing enough cyborg monster. And I do appreciate that as well. It's, through working around limitations and working with limitations instead of trying to be too ambitious, which they were, but I feel like they got lucky and were able to work around that.
I do want to say that I do think that even though King Ghidorah doesn't have, I think, Kawakita's best effects for Godzilla, I think Biollante still has that. Uh-huh. I think that this is actually his best kaiju choreography as far as battle scenes go.
Oh yeah, I do love the fight sequences, especially the initial one with Godzilla and King Ghidorah. With Godzilla like raising up King Ghidorah by its tails and smashing him down in glorious slow motion. It does harken back to Gigan, where Godzilla, holds King Ghidorah by the neck and slams him down.
Yeah. Yeah, that first fight gave you a nice healthy balance of projectile attacks and physical combat. Right. And the second battle, even though it's mostly a beam war, it's actually edited much more concisely than later examples in the franchise. Uh-huh. And also the unique setting of having Godzilla kind of like cornered in the skyscrapers and having the monsters use the skyscrapers to their advantage when they're fighting also gives the scene some extra flavor to that I really enjoy.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's from an editing standpoint, it's one of the most intense fights in the entire franchise.
Absolutely. I failed to mention this with the Biollante stuff, but Biollante is a special effects marvel to behold, as well, in terms of like how that Crete monster was executed. Mm-hmm. Now, moving on from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, we get into what I like to call the downfall of the Heisei series, where all that promise, all that buildup we had for the first 3 movies of this continuity, 2, if we're counting this Heisei retrospective with Kawakita and his team, I feel like all that potential we see in Biollante and King Ghidorah is lost over time, as these movies are now made in a yearly fashion. The special effects aren't nearly as impressive. The characters feel less and less developed as they go along, and these movies range from passable to mediocre. And I get that these movies have fans, and that's great. And I can understand why. I mean, I still get some enjoyment out of these films from time to time. Yeah, I mean, it's just that, looking at these movies critically, for me personally, it's like, I don't really find these movies to be as good as most people say they are. But if you think that they are still as great, I think that's wonderful. That's perfectly great. It's just I just wish that I saw that level of quality from the earlier movies go carried over here.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to get into why we sort of got that qualitative downswing?
Let's see. I feel like you would have a better explanation for that.
Okay. Well, I think there were a number of factors at play here.
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, I'm going to start off with a shout out to somebody who I interviewed last year. That would be Stuart Galbraith IV, who did the audio commentary for the classic media release of Godzilla vs. Monster Zero. He wrote the book Monsters Are Attacking Tokyo, which was a collection of interviews he did with a lot of people in the Godzilla franchise.
Mm-hmm.
He also wrote the first English language biography on Akira Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune.
Mm-hmm.
Great book, which you should read if you like Japanese cinema.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, I asked him because he kind of has sort of the same outlook that you and I do.
Okay.
He likes the first three Heisei films a lot,
mm-hmm.
and isn't so warm about the films that came after that.
Uh-huh.
And I asked him, why do you think that is? When I interviewed him,
mm-hmm.
and he told me that one of his ideas was maybe that Tomoyuki Tanaka had more of a active role. Maybe Tomoyuki Tanaka was more responsible for the quality of the earlier Godzilla films than we like to acknowledge. Mm-hmm. Because it's very true. If you look, Tanaka was the primary overarching force of the Godzilla films from 54 to 91.
91?
Starting with with King Ghidorah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, he was still involved with the later Heisei films, but mostly as an executive producer.
Mm-hmm.
Because at this point, he's getting very old, he's having health issues, and he's not having as much of a creative presence as he had in the past few films.
All right, and the last time he had less control was Ghidorah, and look how that turned out, for better or worse.
Yes. Yep, as we mentioned in our audio commentary for Ghidorah 2 years ago, he was producing that film, but he was hospitalized during production.
Right.
And therefore wasn't, as involved as
he couldn't keep that weird, he wasn't around to keep that weird shit under control.
But anyways, starting with Godzilla versus Mata 92. This is where Shogo Tomiyama becomes more of the dominant producing presence. And one of the first things Tomiyama did was that he hired a relatively inexperienced filmmaker named Takao Okawara,
mm-hmm.
who would be kind of like the sort of like, for lack of a better word, the Ishiro Honda of the Heisei series. He's the guy who would be directing these films more than anybody else going forward. Right.
He ended up directing Mothra, Mechagodzilla 2, and he skipped over to Space Godzilla. He was replaced by Kensho Yamashita, but came back to wrap things up with Destoroyah.
Yep, and he also directed Yamato Takaru, and he would later go on to direct Godzilla 2000.
Interesting.
Yes.
Because only one of those movies I think is great, the other one not so much.
And I concur with that. Anyways, Tomiyama was basically the guy who brought Okawara on board to be the new Godzilla director.
Okay.
In spite of the fact that he'd only made one film beforehand. Actually, here's something I want to say, is that I kind of consider Omori and Okawara to be kind of like sort of like a strange opposites of each other in this kind of way.
The yin and yang.
The yin and yang, yes. Omori is a director who I've seen a sizable number of his other films outside of Godzilla.
Mm-hmm.
Not his entire career spectrum, but a decent portion.
Mm-hmm.
And I gotta say, while I am grateful that Tanaka decided to take a chance on him and bring him in for Violante, looking at his other films, I can't say I really see the magic that Tanaka saw in his other films, because his other movies that I've seen have been infuriatingly mediocre or just flat out awful. So he's one of those guys who made a lot of bad films, but kind of struck gold with Godzilla.
That's funny considering you mentioned, or we established that he's not a Godzilla fan to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
Or you know what? Maybe this is sort of like a Christopher Nolan situation where he's not a comic book fan, but he made some great Batman movies. Maybe because he doesn't have that comic book bias fanboyism in him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. As for Okawara, he too is also not a Godzilla fan. He's a guy who got brought in to do the job. Now Okawara is kind of the opposite. Okawara is a guy who I really do think
probably would have been better off making things besides Godzilla. Because
okay.
if you look at his other films that he made outside of that, they're actually, for the most part, much better than his Godzilla efforts.
Okay.
Like
Yamato Takaru!
Yeah, except for that one. But let's not acknowledge that awful movie. Yeah.
to quote yourself, you don't want to know.
Yeah, you don't want to know. But anyways, a prime example of that would be his very first movie, which was a low-budget ESP fantasy film called Reiko the Psyche Resurrected, in which he directed both the live-action footage and the special effects footage. It's basically like an ESP story set in a high school. These teenagers think that there's ghosts going on in their school building, and they're trying to like solve the mystery to it. And it's actually, for a low-budget film, and considering what he had to work with, it's actually quite impressive. It's very well made. It's very well paced. It's very resourceful. It's visually fun to look at. It's much better than a lot of his later films. Mm-hmm. Which is actually why he got the job to make Godzilla in the first place, was because Tomiyama saw Reiko and was so impressed by it that he thought that Okawara would be ideal for the next Godzilla director.
So he thought he wanted to change things up as opposed to sticking with a director that already is established and already establishes what works.
Yes.
Okay.
Omori, for the record, Omori did write the screenplay for Mothra 92.
Oh.
But Okawara directed it.
Okay.
Having said that, I do think that compared to Reiko, Mothra 92 is kind of a big downgrade in quality. I do think the movie is enjoyable enough for what it is.
True, yeah. There's still a decent amount of redeeming factors to make these movies enjoyable, like I mentioned from the start. It's just that, compared to what came before, it's like, it feels like a downgrade. I'm sorry, continue.
And it just kind of ties back to what I say. I think maybe Okawara would have been better off making things aside from, even though he is known for making Godzilla, I think he probably would have been better off making things outside of Godzilla, frankly. As for why there was a big drop between that, I think it's also as far as why there was a big drop in quality from Reiko to Mothra. I think here's another example why. It's and this is just my theory. I'm just guessing. I'm speculating. But I kind of compare it to the director Sam Peckinpah, who made films like The Wild Bunch and the original Straw Dogs and The Getaway, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, et cetera, and so forth. Peckinpah started his career as a director of television and then made 2 low-budget features. And the second low-budget feature was a film called Ride the High Country, which was absolutely wonderful. But it was still a low-budget movie. And then immediately after that, he had to make this film called Major Dundee, which was this huge, gigantic, star-studded studio product. And he wasn't really sure how to handle it. And I kind of think maybe, and this again, it's just speculation, I think maybe that's also true of Okawara because with Reiko, small budget, low budget, not a lot of studio presence. He's basically on his own. And then with Mothra, he's immediately promoted to making this huge, expensive studio film. He wasn't ready for it.
It's kind of similar to what Hollywood's been doing for a while nowadays with getting young indie talent to work on these big, giant blockbuster films. It's like what happened to Josh Trank. He went from doing Chronicle to the failed Fantastic Four movie, or getting Gareth Edwards, who did Monsters, and then getting him to do Godzilla 14.
Yep. So again, it's kind of like the strange thing. It's kind of a strange opposite with Omori, whereas Omori made a lot of mediocre non-genre films, but struck gold with Godzilla. Okawara made a lot of Godzilla films, but kind of struck gold outside of Godzilla. Besides that, because actually his other non-genre film is a crime thriller called Abduction, which is an absolutely spectacular movie. I was really shocked by how much I love that movie. He made it between Destoroyah and 2000. And it is by far his best movie. It's very well made. It's consistently entertaining. It's visually exciting. It is a non-stop great piece of entertainment. And I'm sorry to say that it's not available stateside yet. It was chosen as one of the 10 best films of 1997, and it deserves it. It's a great picture. That's another reason why I say maybe he would have been better off making things besides, Godzilla pictures.
Right. Another trend I've noticed with these later Heisei films, especially when I've noticed something you can definitely notice with Mothra here, is that a lot of these movies tend to have more of a TV movie feel, and less of a cinematic approach. They feel less cinematic and more like TV quality movies. A lot of them lack any sort of like cinematic flair. A lot of shots are still very static. Everything feels very basic. They all start to blend together, and there are people who enjoy the consistency between these films, but here it's like these movies start to look more and more uniform like, and don't really have any of that visual flair that we got from the earlier movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe a couple of years back you mentioned in comparing like Destoroyah to Godzilla 2000, where Godzilla 2000 feels like there was like a huge visual boost in a huge boost in visual quality, especially like what do you call it, when it comes to the cinematography between like these later Heisei films and Godzilla 2000.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that is a big unfortunate thing. And another big downgrade I've noticed is, like, of course, Koichi Kawakita, with his preference of having these great designs that are barely or poorly brought to life and can barely move. You had like Mothra, Rodan, what was it? Later on, the flying form of Destoroyah. These things are stiff, they're awkward, they can barely move.
The metal bird from Yamato Takeru.
Oh god, the metal bird from Yamato Takeru. Like, I don't know what Koita's I don't know what he was thinking, but for the love of God, he could never do flying creatures right. And I know for some people, this is good enough for them, but for me, I expected more from in the 30 years between like 93 Rodan and 60s Rodan. And,
well, as far as Mothra goes, I actually got to see this film on the big screen last week. And one thing I noticed was that, and this is a big downgrade in a lot of respects. Mothra and Batra, their final forms, have legs.
Right.
Their legs don't move once in the entire movie.
That is very, very true. Except once, where they need to actually do something and grab Godzilla to fly him off.
But even then, they don't actually move. They're just repositioned to hold onto his tail.
Right. They just cut to another shot.
Yeah, it's not like in say Mothra versus Godzilla, where Mothra's legs were constantly moving as she fought Godzilla.
Right. Again, this is like These are movies from 30 years ago that did much better than this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Skipping ahead to Space Godzilla, where Mogira and Space Godzilla are fighting in space, and it's just like a blank black wall with asteroids. Meanwhile, you look at any of Ishiro Honda's and Eiji Tsuburaya's work from the 60s and even the 70s. There's still a lot of these they have these beautiful what do you call them, space backdrops that are wonderfully painted and have so much visual detail on them. It's really an embarrassment when Toho's past films from decades prior are outdoing these movies. And when you look at something like the Gamera trilogy during the late 90s, they were able to outdo everything that Koichi Kawakita and his team was doing during the early 90s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I
will cut Kawakita some slack on this regard.
Uh-huh.
One thing the Heisei series gets criticized for also is the downgrade in the quality of the miniatures.
The miniatures, for me personally, they never bothered me at all, and I thought that they were adequate enough to get the job done. But please go on with what you were saying.
I'll meet you halfway on that. I think they are serviceable, but at the same time, like especially compared to like the miniatures for the Return of Godzilla or a lot of the earlier Showa films, I do think they are a lot more sparse and a lot less convincing, a lot less detailed.
That is true. I guess because they were so small in later movies, I didn't notice the lack of detail.
And that's actually where I will cut Kawakita some slack because, as the Heisei series progressed, they decided, hey, let's make Godzilla even bigger, which means the miniatures got to be made even smaller.
Was that the reason why he was made? He was made bigger in Ghidorah so they can cut back on the model budget.
I don't know if that was their logic, but that's what happened.
Okay, I feel like that might have been the case.
It might have been, but in any event, Kawakita himself actually stated that he wanted to one day bring Godzilla back down to 50 meters because as hard as he and his crew tried, they just could not squeeze that much detail into much smaller sets as they could working with the sets of say from the Tsuburaya years.
Right. And with the downgrade, another aspect of this downgrade I was never a fan of was the over-reliance on animated projectile attacks in place of traditional physical combat within the fight choreography between Godzilla and his foes. And this is what led to the phrase beam spamming and the phrase the Beam Wars trilogy that I like to use for Mothra, Mechagodzilla 2, and Space Godzilla. And for me personally, I'm going to cut Koichi Kawakita some slack when it comes to the choreography with Destoroyah, because I feel like it was a much bigger improvement, and while not as elaborate as Ghidorah or Biollante, after going through the Beam Wars trilogy, I feel like I was good enough. I was satisfied with Destoroyah's fights. It's like, hey, it's something, all right.
I do think the battle at sea in Mothra is actually pretty well choreographed. I like how they use
I'll give you that, definitely.
Yeah, I like how they use the fact that they're fighting in the ocean, and also like Mothra hides behind the barge to hide from Godzilla's ray. I like that use of the environment. And also, during the final battle, there are some good, setting unique touches, like when Batra picks up the Ferris wheel and slams it into Godzilla. That's a good moment.
True. That's a good. Yeah.
Also, when Batra hits the landmark tower of his rays and causes it to fall on top of Godzilla, that's also a good moment there too.
True. Yeah. Again, there's always very nice moments within these movies. Very nice character moments. Very nice action moments. One thing that immediately comes to mind is Rodan's sacrifice, be it unintentional or not, to help Godzilla kick Mechagodzilla's ass. There's the transformation sequence of Mechagodzilla into Super Mechagodzilla. There's the music used for Space Godzilla, the nice sets with his Crystal Empire. There's the Mothra's transformation sequence with the new version of Mothra's song.
Oh yeah.
There's still a lot of good here to commend the filmmakers on when it comes to these later Heisei films. Another thing that's wasted here, I feel like, is Miki Sagusa, where we never mentioned this, but even in King Ghidorah, she was sort of becoming just a mere plot device, where she is the living Godzilla radar for King Ghidorah and Mothra. To give them credit, they try to give her some characterization from Mechagodzilla 2 to make her more of a pro-Godzilla than an anti-Godzilla, which goes into Space Godzilla and Destoroyah, but she's never really given too much of a focus outside of Space Godzilla, which in my personal opinion, was poorly handled and kind of made her out to be more unlikable as a character.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Well, I really do think that Miki Sagusa is a great idea for a character who was just never used that well at any point during the franchise. Biollante, she doesn't influence the story.
Right, but there was some sort of mystique about her. There was some interest with her being so quiet, being this young girl with so much potential in her. To make props to even a frightening degree. It's like this girl to go on to do great things in life.
Yes, exactly, and that's also why it's disappointing that from there on out she'd mostly just kind of devolve into just saying, oh, Godzilla's coming,
right?
Which is basically what she did in King Ghidorah and Mothra.
right, and it's sort of one of those things where because she's often repositioned in a new status quo from film to film with the last three movies of this of the Versus series, it's like my mind as a fan is trying to fill in the blanks as to what led her to go move between these spots. And again, we're going to fan theory here, not proper character storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, especially with Destoroyah, there's a lot of interesting things she says and does to infer to infer a lot of things, to show sparks of what could be a great character outro for her, but it's never expanded upon, and that again leaves you to fill in the blanks for yourself. And for me, I like filling in the blanks to this degree, but I can admit when a character is underwritten.
That's the I like Miki Sagusa as a character, and I like Megumi Adaka as an actress, but Toho never found a way to use either one of them in a way that was especially interesting, unfortunately.
Right. I feel like, to promote an article that you wrote something for the Sci-Fi Wire detailing the entire cinematic history of Miki Sagusa.
Actually, that was for Toho Kingdom, actually.
Oh, very apologies for that. Yeah, you did that for Toho Kingdom, and I highly recommend anyone to check out his article on Toho Kingdom on Miki Sagusa.
Yep, it's called Miki Sagusa, The Confines of Lost Potential.
Absolutely. And let's see. I know instead of focusing on a singular movie like Bylance and Ghidorah, we just sort of been talking about all these movies as a whole, because it's like they all start to blend together in a way.
Yes, indeed.
So, is there anything you'd like to bring up in terms of any movie in particular? Because I do remember you were actually a bigger fan of Space Godzilla than me, and I'm a bigger fan of Destoroyah than you.
Although, to be fair, I kind of feel the same way about both those films in a lot of ways.
Okay.
See, but here's something else we can probably talk about, is that something else that kind of sticks out to me in the Heisei series, from this point on, is that in general the quality of the acting by and large is not that good. And there are a number of reasons as to why that is, and this affects the entire Japanese film industry, not just Toho.
All right, yeah, this is Toho was going through major changes at this point, becoming more of a corporate entity rather than a proper film studio.
Yes, indeed.
This is what I find to be the most fascinating here about this whole situation.
I can talk about this for like 3 hours, but I'll keep it more as condensed as possible. But here's the way to put it. When Toho was first formed in the 1930s, they were basically just a film studio. That's what they did. They had sister companies and things like theater dance. They were basically an entertainment industry. And in the early days, they went all out of their way to make high quality entertainment and to train professionals in their industry. One example is that with all due respect to Ishiro Honda, one of the reasons why he became as good as he was because not just because he was talented, but because he was very thoroughly trained in the craft of filmmaking. Honda spent many years in Toho's assistant director's program. And actually, at the time Toho was called PCL, Photochemical Laboratories. But anyways, in their program, when you were an assistant director, your job was basically to be a director in training. And they taught you the whole aspect of filmmaking. They taught you how to write. They taught you how to direct. They taught you how to edit. They taught you how to work with cinematographers, how to work with art directors. So basically, by the time you got promoted, you knew the whole process of filmmaking, and you were very well versed. And also, you learned not in a classroom, but through experience on the set.
So it's they're taking you through filmmaking boot camp.
That's exactly what it was. Now, that's also how we got directors like Kurosawa, for example. Kurosawa, again, as good as he was, the reason why he became as good as he was because he was trained very thoroughly through the same process, and actually by the same director that taught Honda. That'd be a guy named Kaiju Yamamoto. But yeah, these guys, and also the same was true of actors. Toho had a program called the New Face Program, which is how and when they hired you, they taught you how to become an actor, and they taught you and they very rigorously trained you not only how to act but dance, and et cetera and so forth. And that's also, let's be honest with ourselves. When we think of the actors of the Godzilla series, which of the main eras do we really remember the most?
Yeah, we're always thinking of the always thinking of the characters of the Showa era.
Like, like for example, how many of the actors in the Heisei series can you name without looking them up on Google?
I'm very sorry. I really... Oh, Robert Scott Field. I can remember him. I met the man in person.
Yep, there's one example. But yeah, so by the time we get to this, but anyways, Toho, all those programs I mentioned, when Toho started to fall apart in the 60s, and especially in the 70s, all of that went away. Mm-hmm. And even though Toho financially rebounded in the 80s, those programs did not come back, essentially. And so very often you had actors who were brought into acting these films who did not have a lot of experience, who were not very thoroughly trained, who did not have the experience of, say, like a Akira Takarada or Akumi Mizuno.
Right.
And as a result, you have a lot of acting in these later Heisei films that, charitably put, is not very good.
I mean, at the very least, I would like to give special props to Megumi Odaka for giving it all that she could with her limited roles.
And I do think Odaka got better with experience as she went along. Like when I look at her in, like, say, Biollante, I think she's okay, but when we get to Destoroyah, she's genuinely good.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like, how old was she when she started Biollante? Because it felt like she grew up in cinema.
She was a teenager when she started in Biollante, and she is like 24, 25, I think, when she did Destoroyah.
Wow, yeah.
But anyways, and the other problem is that I think that a lot of these directors also were not actually, as far as directors go, let's talk about Okawara, for example, also. Okawara was also an assistant director during his early career, but but compared to Honda, you know what his jobs as an AD were?
What?
Carry the storyboards, maintain communication between camera A and camera B, make sure the actors show up on time.
So he was like the go-between guy.
Yeah, so he spent a lot of time on a number of sets, but nobody showed him how to do the films, how to make movies. Nobody showed him the ropes or how to do things. So, and basically, by his, and this is also by Okawara's own admission. This is what he said, not me.
Yeah.
The way he learned filmmaking was by just watching his seniors in action.
Right.
He was an assistant to Kurosawa on his samurai film Kagemusha. Mm-hmm. And Okawara, by his own admission, learned what he learned from Kurosawa just by watching him. Kurosawa did not take him under his wing and show him anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's an entirely different kind of, shall we say, training program compared to like the films of Ishiro Honda.
Yeah. And
Honda's background. And also, that also shows that Okawara is just in general not a very good director of actors. Like in Mechagodzilla 2, there's this really cringy scene where when the girl Asuza says goodbye to baby Godzilla, like when she cries into his head, it's like high school level acting. It's really bad. Ooh. And Okawara doesn't even bother to like change the camera angle to hide how bad her expressions are. And then even worse, 2 minutes later, when she's on her headset talking to Miki, she's dry-eyed and blank-faced. Even though she's supposed to have been crying, 2 minutes earlier.
Right.
There's no subtlety there. There's no playing it gentle. There's no two ways about it. That's just bad acting and a really big oversight on Okawara's part as the director.
Yeah.
So that you have that. Now, of course, throughout the Heisei films, on occasion you do get young actors who are just naturally good actors. Like we mentioned, we think Megumi Odaka got a lot better as she went along through practice. But the batting average for the young actors in the Heisei series, just by and large, isn't all that good.
I am curious as to how many of them went on to have actual film careers, because I think what was the name of the actor who was Katagiri from Godzilla 2000? Right, because I know he continues to act to this very day. I would see him in movie trailers and be like, "Holy shit, I know you!"
Oh yeah, a lot of them have continued to act, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the films have improved, or that they have directors to who really know how to bring out the best of them.
Right. It seems like as the years go by, Toho becomes less of a of a film studio, and instead of focusing on having talented people make art, they're focusing on just being like a corporate run entity there to make products.
Yeah, and also as far you mentioned Godzilla 2000, one of the reasons why, and also the acting in Godzilla 2000 is quite good.
Yeah,
but I don't think that's largely because of Okawara. I think that's just because, for once, he had an all-out decent cast. Like when you look at Godzilla 2000, you have Takahiro Murata, who also was in Mothra 92 and gave one of the better performances in that film.
Oh yeah,
Murata, award-winning actor. Hiroshi Abe, award-winning actor. Naomi Nisha, award-winning actress. You have Shiro Sano. These are people who are very good actors, very instinctive actors, and who are good in just about everything, no matter who's directing them. So again, my speculation, but I say it's largely just because these are just very instinctive actors who just know how to act very well on their own and don't need a director's guidance to show them, when they're doing a good job or not.
So it's like based on like sort of like natural talent and experience.
Absolutely, and you do have directors who, by their own admission, are not actors directors, and I imagine that Okawara is one of them because. Again, it wasn't until Godzilla 2000 when he had an all-out decent cast that the acting, by and large, was very good. And before that, it wasn't so good, by and large, with some honorable exceptions, of course.
Right. Now, do you know who Kensho Yamashita was, who came in just for Space Godzilla?
Yes, Kensho Yamashita was a guy who basically got the job for Space Godzilla because Okawara was. At the time, actually, do you want to talk about the how should we put this? The Heisei series as it relates to like the TriStar film, or do you want to get into that later?
Okay, so from what I understand at this, back in 1993, I believe that they wanted to make Mechagodzilla vs. Mechagodzilla the last of the 80s, 90s series. And during this point, I guess like the original idea was to have a TriStar Godzilla for 1994. But that wasn't going to be the case, and for whatever reason, they pushed it from 94 to 98. And so they continued the Godzilla series up until 95, and by that point, they allowed Hollywood to take over for the time being. But is there more information to this story?
Yeah, I'll get into that. Yeah, because Toho and TriStar signed their deal in 1992. Okay. And so they wanted Mechagodzilla 2 to be the end of the series because, as you mentioned, the unmade Jan de Bont Godzilla film was going to be made the following year. However, as we know, that never happened.
Right, either because it was too expensive or too close to the spirit of Godzilla. Exactly.
As you mentioned, Toho was not contractually obliged to end the Godzilla series for TriStar. It was just their plan.
Right. They're all about like the whole mutual respect thing, very Japanese-like.
Yes.
Which is very interesting considering what's going to happen in the third part of our retrospective.
Yes, indeed. But anyways, they were not obliged in the franchise. They wanted to do it anyway. But after the Jan de Bont film never got made, they decided to make more films. But by this point, Okawara, their go-to guy who made Mothra Mechagodzilla 2, is now working on Yamato Takeru. So for this case, they brought in a replacement director.
Yamato Takeru and Space Godzilla were made the same year.
Yes.
Okay,
and Yamato Takeru came out first.
Right, and I feel like they put more of an effort on that film than Space Godzilla.
Well, I don't know. I think the level of effort kind of even between the two of them.
You know what? Debatably, I think you're right there.
From a technical execution standpoint, I think they're actually pretty close to one another. But
that is sad.
But anyways, so Okawara is occupied elsewhere, and they need somebody to replace him. And this is also an example of how Toho was operating at the time. These were Yamashita's credentials. He'd worked with Ishiro Honda on Terra Mechagodzilla as an assistant. And he'd made 2 films beforehand, and the previous film he made was a special effects picture called 19.
Okay.
Those were his credentials. He had some experience, and he'd worked with special effects before. Just like Okawara. That's basically it.
I see. So it's another individual who's sort of like underprepared for this role.
Underprepared, not properly experienced, and probably not the best, probably not ideal for the job.
Yeah. So I guess like even if you like for a fan who likes these movies equally, there is a sign here that they were getting less and less experienced people as they went along.
Yes. Yes, and just like Okawara, Yamashita did not have the luxury of being, thoroughly trained in his craft like, say, Honda had back in his day.
Right.
So that's basically it. He was Space Godzilla was kind of like a last minute call because the TriStar film was not coming, and Yamashita was just basically like the gun for hire, so to speak, to make the film.
Right.
That's basically it.
And that would explain why they sort of made this plot just to have Godzilla face yet another doppelganger of himself, which he kind of already got with the likes of Mechagodzilla the year prior and Biollante to a degree.
Yes.
And if there's one thing I like to say is like the one thing I think is still kept consistent throughout these movies is the characterization of Godzilla himself. Even if he doesn't really factor into the plot that much, especially with Godzilla vs. Mothra, where it feels like you can write him out of the movie completely and the movie still wouldn't change all that much. They still give him the presence that he needs. His design itself has stood out even like 20 years later after the series concluded. He still acts like a very tragic figure that was an element that's taken over from carried over from King Ghidorah. The idea of him becoming this sort of adopted father for Godzilla Jr. and seeing that character grow as the series progresses, having him, makes him more of a how would I say, sympathetic character. I feel like he's still like the brightest spot throughout this series, and I can see why that is still like, if he's like of course the movies are named after him, he is the star of the show, and if he doesn't work, then the entire series falls apart as a result. But the fact that he remains to be so good and so developed as a Godzilla in the history of Godzillas, I feel like that's the reason why so many people return to the Heisei series or the Versus series to this very day.
Yeah, and that's what stands out to me too. Is that I really do think that the Heisei series is ideal as far as like the anti-hero version of Godzilla. When I think of an anti-hero Godzilla, this is what I think of.
Absolutely, yeah. He's someone who he doesn't really set out to protect the world. He doesn't really even protect his land. He just like, if you fuck with me, I'm gonna make you pay for it.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think Kepachiro Satsuma became a really good suit actor for Godzilla.
Right, totally. I feel bad we failed to mention him up to this point, but it's like, yeah, major props for him for being a great Godzilla throughout this era of Godzilla's history.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and it is kind of surprising that they never went with him after Haruo Nakajima retired and they got someone else to do it. Meanwhile, he would be playing against that person. It's funny, like when people think of like,
Satsuma's involvement in the Showa series ended with Gigan when Nakajima was still Godzilla.
Oh, really? Okay, I thought Satsuma also played Gigan and Hedorah.
Yeah, he played Gigan and Hedorah when Nakajima was still playing Godzilla.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But he was not involved in Megalon or the Mechagodzilla films when Nakajima had stopped playing Godzilla.
Right. Okay, thanks for correcting me on that. And let's see, I forgot, did he start with 84 or with Night 89?
It was 84, yes.
84, okay then. All right, awesome. And let's see, I guess we can skip ahead to the end of this Versus series with Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. And this is a rather this has become, this used to be a fan favorite among Godzilla fans. But I've noticed within like the last 5 years, it's become sort of divisive as more and more people have come out of the woodwork, if you can say, detractors of this film that have, would make the argument that this is in fact a poorly made movie, or as poorly made as the previous three movies in this series. For me personally, I know I've talked to my friends Bill and Dylan about this. We still feel as strongly about Destoroyah as previous films, but I do understand why people have issues with this movie. It carries a lot of the same baggage that the other three movies have, underdeveloped characters, lackluster special effects. But for me, it's like those problems, I acknowledge that they're there, but they don't bother me as much as they do with other people. And having seen this movie on the big screen about a year ago, in like this old little independently run movie theater that screens old movies.
And it was on film too, right?
On film, yes. It was on a good old-fashioned classic film reel. I was like getting the vintage experiment, getting to hear the like click 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 click, and you can hear the sound of the gear shifting as they switch to a new film. That was the same experience with Biollante as well. But having watched that movie recently on the big screen, it's like I still feel as strong as I do with this movie, and it's like, in my opinion, I feel like it's a really good way to end the series. It was the best way they could have ended the Versus series, and it felt like a very appropriate end to Godzilla's journey as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you feel about the movie after so many years?
Well, like you, it was a huge favorite of mine growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, I think it's kind of middle of the road for me, which is honestly how I feel about most of the Heisei films. Honestly, I really do think Destoroyah is just kind of like for me, it's just kind of like it's another Heisei film.
Uh-huh.
And it's got the same things that I like about the Heisei films and the same things I don't like about the Heisei films. I will say this: it's very ambitious.
Oh yeah, definitely.
For how it tries to connect itself, especially with how it tries to connect itself with the original Godzilla film.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
But I really do think that just like a lot of the previous films, there's just a lot of great ideas that just don't go anywhere, especially interesting.
Mm.
Junior has apparently become a violent killer. He's apparently killing whales.
Uh-huh.
They mentioned that once and never follow up on it.
Mm-hmm.
Next time we see him, he's all peaceful and happy, just walking along the beach.
Right. Hey, man, a monster's got to eat, all right.
There's one line where Mickey says she's losing her powers. They mention that once, and that goes nowhere either.
Uh-huh. There is like this idea that the grandsons of the grandchildren of Dr. Yamane feels there's some sort of like a idea of like legacy and trying to live up to the standards set by your families, or like live up to the expectations of your families and ancestors, and that's sort of lost as the plot goes forward. Yeah, there was the idea of like building an oxygen destroyer, but then that which would have been an interesting debate, but then it's like that subplot kind of is brushed aside when they're like, oh, we can just use Destoroyah as our oxygen destroyer. So there goes that subplot.
They bring back Emiko Yamane, a character from the first movie, and get the same actress to play her, and she has 2 very brief scenes, and then she's brushed aside and forgotten about and never appears again.
Right.
That said, though, I do think Destoroyah is better made than Okawara's last couple films. Mm-hmm. I think it's a visually a little bit more exciting. There's more camera movement. There's like some good crane shots. Mm-hmm. I think it's like technically a bit better than his last couple efforts. It's kind of like hinting at like the better work to come with like Abduction and Godzilla 2000.
We still get some movie a good Hollywood Hollywood influences there with aliens.
It's like we forgot to mention that Omori, who wrote Destoroyah and Mothman 2, both those films have a lot of Hollywood influence sequences.
Like Mothra had Indiana Jones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or as I like to call him, Asiana Jones.
Yep, then you have the alien sequence in Destoroyah. Yeah, and that's, again, screenwriter Kazuki Omori, his affinity for Hollywood films. So,
it's kind of
surprise there.
It's kind of fun to poke fun at them, but it's like, I always considered it a negative feature of the Heisei series just because it feels so distracting, like stylistic-wise. You're like, I see what you're doing here. It's plainly obvious. It's like as soon as like, what was it? The Destoroyah is attacking that taxi cab with
Mm-hmm.
the main female lead in there. It's like I'm almost expecting expecting Ripley to show up. It's like, get away from her, you bitch!
You bitch! Oh yeah, but, also here's the funny thing. When I watched Destoroyah again last time, what I really took away is that Megan Yodaka as Miki Sagusa, she is just absolutely wonderful in this movie.
Totally,
she has so many moments where she just acts without any dialogue, just using her eyes alone.
Oh yeah, she definitely brings a lot of gravitas to every scene she's in.
Yeah, I don't credit that to the director. I credit that to her just because she just naturally just got better with each film as she went along. And she is just absolutely so good in this film that I feel bad that as always, she's still squandered on a character that just never gets a chance to shine and express herself in a way that's really interesting.
It feels like maybe perhaps this movie was trying to bite off more than it can chew by having so many characters to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is also a thing that Omori sometimes does, putting too many characters into a film. And also, but I do think that unlike, say, Biollante and King Ghidorah, the characters here, by and large, are just not that interesting. That's just me, though. That's my opinion.
Yeah, for me, it's I can see the potential for more there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess for me, it's like their introductions were satisfying enough for me to want to be invested in these characters. But I know that's just me.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that of Godzilla sort of becoming a literal nuclear bomb, and it's like him succumbing to his own radiation. It's like, I think it's very appropriate that Godzilla succumbs to his own power as opposed to being brought down by any other external force. And I thought that the death scene was handled miraculously well. And I do love the idea of having such an ambiguous ending and sort of carry on this idea that would be repeated in other Godzilla films, where it's like, as long as humanity continues to make mistakes, there will always be a Godzilla there to watch over them.
Yeah, actually, I will say though, with all my misgivings with this film, the monster scenes are fantastic.
Absolutely.
Godzilla's attack on Hong Kong, the scene where the big crab destroyer blows up the military and then flies off in the sky, the final battle, that's all spectacular stuff.
As much as I love the Hong Kong sequence, I will give it to Titan Goji for pointing out how in the composite shots where Godzilla is like, they do this technique a lot of having a lot of composite shots instead of like actual models and actors, where they just have real life buildings and not just like take shots of like extras, but the extras are like the real people interacting in those buildings and streets, and have Godzilla like in the skyline. And here in that shot of Hong Kong, you just see people like normally driving or walking around.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on how much it bothers you. Obviously, it was a problem for him. Doesn't bother me, but I think it's still really funny to think about it.
It is.
It's like, them's the breaks. Sorry, as you were saying, like, you enjoyed the action sequences.
Yeah.
Godzilla's attacks rampages were good. Destoroyah has easily become like a fan favorite. I would say, I don't know, what do you think is like the most popular monster to come out of this series? Because I would say it would be either Destoroyah or Biollante.
I can't speak for the fan base, but I think Destoroyah's kind of like become more of a general favorite because of his association with the film in which Godzilla dies.
Yeah,
and the fact that he is, the creation of the weapon which killed the first Godzilla.
True. Yeah.
Or a byproduct, I should say.
I
will say that's a clever idea, tying Godzilla's enemy to his past.
Totally. Yeah. And I do like the idea that this series tries to go forward with trying to have the majority of these monsters have some sort of tie to Godzilla, where it's like Godzilla and King Ghidorah share the same origin. Biollante is made from the DNA of Godzilla. Same goes for Space Godzilla. Destoroyah was created by the same force that killed Godzilla. There's always some sort of connection there. And It's something I kind of like to call like the Batman effect, where there's always some sort. Each character is supposed to be some sort of like mirror to the protagonist, as opposed to, hey, here's a random monster showing up out of nowhere. Although you can make the argument for Space Godzilla.
Yep.
He is a random monster coming out of nowhere with a tacked on backstory brought by the retcon.
No. Two tacked on backstories.
Two tacked on, yeah.
Or two possibilities.
Right, because these writers didn't bother. The writer didn't bother to think of what was going to happen here. Wait, did Okawara also write Space Godzilla?
You mean Omori?
Oh, sorry, Omori. Yeah, did he wrote Space Godzilla?
He did not write Space Godzilla or Mechagodzilla 2.
Okay, he just did Mothra then.
Mothra and Destoroyah.
And Destoroyah. Okay. So, that makes even more sense that they wouldn't even remember that King Ghidorah time travel was a thing.
Yeah, and again, when they talk about the fact that there were two Godzillas, they only do it in a how can we explain Destoroyah kind of way. It's not done in a we figured out the time travel kind of thing.
Right. So it's also funny that Omori would be writing Ghidorah and Destoroyah, one movie establishing two Godzillas, the other establishing one Godzilla.
Yeah. And I seriously doubt that he's thought about this nearly as much as the fans have over the years.
Right. It's like, I'm sure he, to this day, still doesn't give a shit.
I'm sure he doesn't care whatsoever.
Yeah. So I guess, unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about with Destoroyah,
did you want to mention how why the Heisei series came to end as it came to end?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I guess it came to an end, I'm assuming, solely because of Godzilla 98.
Well, it's sort of, but not quite. It's kind of an interesting, here's what they've said, and here's what it also might have been.
Okay.
At the time that Destoroyah was made, the TriStar film still had not been, fully put in production yet.
Right.
Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin would not actually be brought on board until 1996, the following year.
So at this point, they're sort of scrambling the Jan de Bond version and sort of starting over from scratch at this point.
Exactly. Now, at the time of Destoroyah's release, Tomiyama told an interviewer that he wanted to end the series because, number one, he was tired of waiting for the TriStar film. And number two, he wanted to end the Heisei series before the film started losing quality.
Now
that
is ironic there.
Now, that's what he said. Now, people like Steve Reifel have postulated something much more believable, if you ask me, and I fully back this.
Uh-huh.
Steve has speculated, and I agree, that it was probably more of an economical choice. Because the Heisei Godzilla, the Godzilla films in the 90s, they were very expensive to produce.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes it's hard to believe with what you see on the screen, but they were very expensive to produce.
Well, yeah, especially for Japanese films at the time.
Yes, and all of the 90s films were successful to varying degrees. They all made money.
Oh yeah, I would argue that this was perhaps the most popular Godzilla will ever be from here on out.
Until Shin Godzilla.
Yeah, I would count Shin Godzilla as sort of not an outlier, what do you call it? A fluke, if anything.
Oh, sure. Well, as far as the films go, yes.
Yeah. In terms of its Godzilla's overall presence in Japanese pop culture.
Oh yeah, people went to see the Heisei films because Godzilla was in them.
Right, whereas with Shin Godzilla is because Anno was about it and it was about politics.
Exactly. They didn't go to see Shin Godzilla because of the monster. They went to see it because of everything else.
Yeah, it was sort of the bandwagon effect where, they say it, well, they saw it, well, I guess I got to see it as well.
Mm-hmm. But anyways, even though the later Heisei films were successful, over time they were gradually losing their audiences. Not to where they lost money, but they were losing audiences. Mothra 92 hit the peak with 4.2 million tickets sold.
Okay.
Mechagodzilla 2 sold 3.8 million tickets.
Mm-hmm.
Space Godzilla sold 3.4 million tickets. So that's a loss of about 400,000 people with each movie.
Uh-huh.
And and people have speculated, and I think it's true, that Tomiyama and Toho just realized, if we keep this up, we either have to cut the budgets back on the films, or we start taking losses on the films.
I see. So they wanted to end it while things were still good.
And of course, with Destoroyah, they hyped up the whole Godzilla dies thing. That was their big marketing selling point.
That was that was literally the slogan.
But before TriStar did the whole "his foot's as big as the sign" kind of thing, Tomiyama had I don't know if somebody in Toho had the marketing team create these big, tall, vertical signs that had the Japanese lettering saying "Godzilla dies," and showing those around Japan.
Right.
It made international news. It was reported on the radio, on television, and so on and so forth. It was a big publicity stunt, and it paid off. It paid off because Godzilla vs. Destoroyah was almost as profitable as Mouth of 92 was.
Oh, nice. I mean, hey, if it worked for Superman 3 years prior, then why not Godzilla?
Yep, there you go.
Yeah, okay. So that does paint a much clearer picture of what was going on back in 1995. And eventually this series came to an end. A couple years later, we got the TriStar Godzilla, which obviously didn't pan out the way Toho and Sony was hoping it would. And eventually, just a year later, they decided to get back on track with Godzilla 2000. But that is a story for another time, my friends, for this is actually going to be a multi-part series. Sorry, I didn't establish that early on at the beginning of this podcast, but given how we're already 2 hours into this podcast, I feel like now is a good point to end things off by talking about at least the lasting legacy of the Versus series, as, Japan would come to know it as, or the Heisei series as the American fans like to call it as. So, why do you think, Patrick, that people still fondly remember the Heisei series as much as it does, and what do you think has been its overall impact on the franchise?
I think I think a big reason why the Heisei series is as big as it is with fans is because it's partially a generational thing. For a lot of people growing up, this was their Godzilla.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I feel like this was available at some point on VHS in America. Obviously, for Japanese, this was their Godzilla that they grew up with. For us, we saw this a lot on television, on the Sci-Fi Channel and whatnot. We saw it on those bare bones Sony TriStar DVDs and slightly less bare bone Blu-rays. These were perhaps were widely available for many years. And even to this day, I think Toho still remembers that these movies have a lot of nostalgic value. I mean, why else would the majority of SH Monster Arts figures would be solely on or at least when they first started, so solely focused on the 90s characters, or the 90s
and also,
designs.
Also, as we mentioned, this is this is the definitive anti-hero Godzilla.
Oh, totally.
So that also plays a big. When people think of a Godzilla who's just out for himself, this is the one that comes to mind more often than not.
Totally, and that design itself has certainly become iconic to the point where you look at Godzilla merchandise at the Godzilla store, you look at the Godzilla Hotel in Shibuya, you look at the Godzilla versus Evangelion cross-promotion material. What version do you see? The 90s design.
And also, these are films in which Godzilla himself is played relatively straight, and sometimes the human sequences have funny moments in them, but the films don't try to be super campy like the 70s movies.
True, yeah. It's definitely it takes itself serious. It's sort of like an evolution of the 60s, the height of the 60s Godzilla, where it takes itself seriously but knows how to have fun with its sci-fi, fantasy sci-fi material. This is a less cynical world where people are inclined to believe that these crazy things are actually happening in their lives. And it's I feel like whenever people try to envision their dream Godzilla film, I think most people tend to go try to go for like the tone, the look and feel, or the tone and style of the Heisei Godzilla series. Yeah, so I think like idea-wise, concept-wise, stylistic-wise, aesthetic-wise, this sort of like set the path for many future Godzilla storytellers down the line. At least in the West. And I can't really say how much it's impacted Japanese culture, but I would say, like, yeah, obviously these were definitely very huge when they were out in Japan, and like, obviously they still make merchandise based off of these films, and it's clear to see that there is a lot of love for this period of Godzilla films, and that I still feel like we'll still feel its influence even years afterwards.
Yeah, and for the record, even though I've kind of like backhanded some of these films, in this conversation, I still enjoy most of them for what they are.
True, yeah. I mean, it's not like it's like a Monotakeru thing where it's like we're never gonna revisit it. Like, I don't mind popping in these movies, every couple of years. In some cases,
except for Space Godzilla.
Yeah.
except for that
one. Trust me, I've already explained it in a 30-minute review. But yeah, I can clearly see why these films have so much love and support for them. And yeah, I'm very happy they exist, and I will forever be grateful for their existence.
And I also like like my second and third Godzilla films were versus King Ghidorah and versus Mothra 92. So before that, I'd seen Godzilla 2000, which informed me of it, that there was like the Japanese Godzilla. And it was seeing those two Heisei films, back to back on the Sci-Fi Channel back in like the early 2000s that made me realize there was a whole franchise of Japanese Godzilla films, and that this was something I really wanted to get into. So I will always have these films to thank for that in that regard as well.
Totally. And even like as for someone who doesn't view these movies in high regard, at the very least, it would set like a precedence for you to say, hey, I think I can do better, and I'm going to show them. So I feel like it's also a good motivator for what to do and what not to do for future filmmakers out there who wish to explore the world of giant monster cinema.
Yeah, we should also say that, even though she was never used, to her full potential, Miki Sagusa is still a name as far as characters in the series go.
Yeah, it's definitely a fan favorite character. I mean, like, heck, you got to see her in person at last year's G-Fest, and why was she there? Because people remember and love that character of her that she played many years ago.
Yep, and as she mentioned it, she was asked at her panel, would you ever want to be in another Godzilla film? And of course, as they always say, she answered in English, of course.
I thought she was going to say yes, always.
Always. If that ever happens, I'd say bring her on board and hopefully give her like a chance to do more than she was allowed to do in the Heisei series. I'd be on board for that.
I mean, and here's an interesting thing about the legacy of Miki Sagusa. Only once in the history of IDW Godzilla comics has a character from the movies ever shown up in a single issue of the comics, and guess who it was?
It was Miki?
It was Miki Sagusa. I was like, no, it's Dr. Steve Martin. No, yes, it's Miki. It's like he just shows up out of nowhere. They never did found a body. So, but yeah, she appeared for one time only in a one-off story called Godzilla Legends #3, starring Titanosaurus.
Oh, nice.
Yes, where it was the only time where they ever used characters from a character from the movies, and the only time they ever showed an alien species from the movies, that being the gorilla aliens from the planet from the third black hole, or whatever it was called.
Oh, actually, here's something else we could probably say. As far, I don't know if you want to add this in like an earlier point of the video or just leave it here. I'll let you decide that. But
okay.
I think something else that we can say as far as the inconsistency of the Heisei series is the that old phrase of too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
You know, we have so many different directors. We have so many different writers. Like we had Wataru Mimura writing Mechagodzilla 2.
Mm-hmm.
We had Hiroshi Kashiwabara writing Space Godzilla. We had Omori writing Mothra and Destoroyah, as well as his 2 films. And we had 84, which was of its own thing. So that whole variety of different people working on these films, even though they do exist within a set continuity series, you know, having that many different creative ideas working in these films all together, you know, all that can result in films that, you know, are going to be, you know, tone-wise, story-wise, et cetera, and so forth, you know, not too terribly similar, not too terribly strict in terms of continuity.
Right. And with the time limit of 1 single year, it would explain what, and on top of having too many cooks in the kitchen, that would explain why there would be this sort of like, what do you call it, fast and loose approach to the continuity, where it's like, who cares? Let's just go for it. Let's just make shit up as we go along. And maybe that might have influenced the idea for the 2000s films to take the anthology approach, to avoid having this sort of, to take advantage of this sort of collection of filmmakers. But I guess we can talk about that when we talk about the Millennium series next. But yeah, suffice to say is that, like, it seems like Toho didn't really learn their lesson as they went along with the 2000s films. So, I feel like now is the time to end things here, unless you have anything else to say about the films.
No, I think we covered the bases pretty thoroughly.
All right, thank you. And thank you again very much, man, for joining me on this the part 1 of our look through the history of the Heisei era of Godzilla films. And where can people find you?
Well, I'm pretty active as a writer on both Toho Kingdom and Sci-Fi Wire, which is the official news site for the Sci-Fi Channel. I'm always publishing. I'm publishing stuff about, you know, something, you know, there here and there. Sometimes I do interviews. Sometimes I do articles or reviews of specific films. Sometimes I do pieces on, you know, more overarching things in the Godzilla franchise. And sometimes I write about things that have nothing to do with Godzilla whatsoever, and I think those are also worth talking about and such. Like I interviewed Michael Biehn, who was in the Terminator and Aliens and the Abyss recently.
Fantastic.
Yep, and I also write about things like, you know, Kurosawa and Mikio Naruse and et cetera and so forth for Toho Kingdom. So I'm always writing about something related to movies, but those would be like the 2 venues that you'll find my work most often.
Impressive, man. Absolutely impressive. So, and of course, you can find me here on the Kaiju Noir channel. All of our links are in the description below. And stay tuned, folks, because we're not done yet, as we'll have parts 2 and 3 of our complete Heisei retrospective. Next time, we'll be talking about what fans dub the Millennium series, or what Japan calls the X series, as we delve into the films from 1999 to 2004. So until next time, everybody, I have been Andres Perez, aka Kaiju Noir.
And I have been Patrick Galvan, aka the pretentious Toho Kingdom critic, truth-telling, you know, intergalactic, you know, whatever
Unbiased
I am, unbiased one. And yeah, I'm just
the critic formerly known as the unknown 837.
Yes, that guy.
And until next time, everybody, take care.